We talk Texas football here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, with Steve Helwick. You can join Steve on SB Nation's Underdog Dynasty and also Hustle Belt. And, of course, he has covered the University of Texas, his alma mater, for quite some time as well. Steve, how you doing today?
I'm doing excellent. Fun weekend of watching football. We're hitting the home stretch now, and this week and next week are a lot of rescheduled games, and then we have conference championships, and just hoping as many games as possible happen out of it.
Texas, another one of the many programs who are rescheduling games, with Kansas coming up, as well as Kansas State this Saturday. Unfortunately, because of a missed kick at the end of the game against Iowa State, a game that we recapped with Steve right here, the Longhorns out of the Big 12 championship race at 4-3, 5-3 overall. Just your thoughts about this Texas season as they head down the home stretch and most likely will play in a bowl game after two probable wins against the two Kansas schools.
It's been fine. I don't think the 5-3 record looks like what Texas fans were hoping going into the season, but the schedule really eases out from here. Kansas State, I don't think there's a team in college football that's getting worse from week to week than the Kansas State Wildcats. That win over Oklahoma seems so long ago for the program, and they just lost to Baylor and got shut out by Iowa State in their last two games. So very winnable game coming up for Texas and Manhattan. Then you close the season with a winless Kansas team. I know Texas has struggled with them in the past three of the past four seasons, but that really should be a victory over Les Miles' squad there. But Texas is probably going to finish the regular season 7-3 with three losses that were all decided in the final minute. And that Oklahoma game goes to 4 overtimes. The TCU game, Keontae Ingram fumbles on the 1 yard line with a chance to take a late lead. An Iowa State game, they give up a touchdown with about a minute and a half left, and Cameron Dicker misses the game-tying field goal from 57. And they took a sack right before that field goal attempt happened. So there's a lot of what-ifs you can play with this Texas season, but it's a good team. The Longhorns are a very high-ceiling, low-floor team, I would describe this year, where they seem to play to the level of their opponent every single week, but they're a team where you would feel comfortable that they could beat almost any team in the nation outside of maybe a Bama or Clemson, because their ceiling seems that high when Sam Ehlinger is playing well, when Joseph Asai and their run defense is playing well. But then you see the Longhorns just make a lot of bad penalties, mental errors, and then you find themselves in a shootout with Texas Tech that comes down to overtime. So the Longhorns really have high volatility in their level of play this year, and that kind of hurt them in some of those losses.
Much of the ceiling taken away from Texas for the final three games, though, including the bowl game, as they have an opt-out both on the offensive side and the defensive side, as we see these announcements being made across the nation, Steve, as teams fall out of contention. So the Longhorns have a couple themselves.
Left tackle Samuel Cosmi is going to be a big one. Cosmi is probably a potential top 10 NFL draft pick. And I guess with the conference title hopes, they're not officially out of the way, but just about out of the way for the Longhorns after that loss to Iowa State. I think Cosmi is going to like his NFL chances and not continue working with a team when, games could be canceled and all of that. So that preparing for the NFL is more of a certainty. So Cosmi is going to make that decision in a pandemic, and he's probably going to be one of the top linemen drafted this year, potential All-American. He's been great at pass protection, especially in his time with the Longhorns at that left tackle position. So he's going to be a huge miss on the offensive line. So I think Kansas State's pass rush could benefit from that a little this weekend. And on the defensive side, there's Caden Stearns. Caden Stearns had a really good freshman season, I thought, in 2018 when he had 4 interceptions and was one of the top on the team with 62 tackles. We haven't seen really that season replicate itself since. He was injured for some of 2019 and 2020. He hasn't really been the same in pass protection, but Stearns he was a highly recruited prospect. He still has a lot of talent, I think, in him. And for him, he's another player who believes it's worth it to test the waters of the NFL, especially considering that the NFL right now is scheduled to play all 16 games with every team. And in this pandemic right now, the NFL is more of a certainty to happen than college football. So I completely understand anybody who's iffy on their decision just wanting to go to the NFL because of the guarantee there.
Caden Stearns wraps up his 2020 campaign in Austin with 52 tackles, 1.5 tackles for loss, and 1 interception, following what Steve just outlined that brilliant freshman campaign with 4 interceptions and 62 total tackles. Steve Helwick on the line. You can catch him on Hustle Belt and also Underdog Dynasty on SB Nation. We have him on here also to talk Texas football because Steve has covered Texas for quite some time and has some pride there as a University of Texas grad as well. All right, Steve, here we go. Tom Herman. He has his critics. He has his support base, and for good reason, I believe, because Mack Brown certainly lifted Texas out of a down period in the 1990s and won 77% of his games, a national championship, another national championship game appearance, consistent contention in the Big 12 with Oklahoma, finishing in the top 10 most of the time during his stay at Texas. Charlie Strong comes in, 5 to 6 wins per year, certainly didn't come anywhere close to expectations. So Tom Herman has certainly upgraded both the recruiting and the on-field performance from what we saw with Charlie Strong. But still, I think most observers seeing Texas as a top 5 to 10 program in the nation historically and based on the talent base there in Texas and the resources, doesn't see now that Tom Herman is in his 4th season, the winning coming to the fruition of what would be expected in competing for Big 12 championships every year and college football playoff appearances.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of things you can analyze in the Tom Herman era. What's gone right? What's gone wrong? What's gone right is he wins his big games. He already had that 2018 Red River rivalry game against Oklahoma, big win there. He's 3-0 in bowl games, and the last 2 of them he was really heavy underdog against Georgia in that 2018 Sugar Bowl. That Georgia team was tweeting while Oklahoma was getting boat raced in the playoff. That Georgia team was tweeting that they deserved to be there. Texas took it personally, and they just stuffed them at the line of scrimmage that game, and the Longhorns won 28-21 in a game that was really closer on the scoreboard than it seemed to be while the game was going on. And then Texas played Utah last year, a Utah team that was 1 win away from the playoff, very similar to Georgia. They fall out of the New Year Six, go to the Alamo Bowl, and Texas just pounds them. It wasn't even close throughout the entire game. Texas just kept sacking Tyler Huntley in that game. Joseph Asai and the Texas defense really made a statement, and the Longhorns finished ranked for the 2nd straight year, something you weren't seeing in the Charlie Strong era with all those losing teams. So I thought that was 2 solid seasons in a row. I know a lot of people were expecting Texas to build on that Sugar Bowl win, though, and maybe turn it into a Big 12 title, maybe turn it into another New Year Six bowl game. But it was, I can see why the 5 losses in 2019 was a little disappointing, but still, they finished strong. They build on that. Tom Herman's 3-0 in bowl games, and he's been underdogs in all of those. He is very good as an underdog. The problem is the games like when Texas is playing games against teams that are kind of close to it in stature, are the Iowa States, the TCU, the games that aren't going to get your college game day. The game day crew is not going to come. It's not a team with a high ranking next to its name. Those are the games that Texas has really squandered throughout the Tom Herman era. And I mean, last year they almost lost to Kansas. That would have been a huge disaster. And I think we would change the conversation around Herman if he did lose that game. So he's battled a lot of close games. Almost every single Texas game comes down to the wire. So they play thrilling football, and there are a lot of winnable games. I can see why critics would point to the losing close games like this, because here's a stat I pulled from Zach Barnett of Football Scoop on Twitter. Last week against Iowa State, Texas just lost a game where it punted twice. It had 7 yards of play. It led for 58.5 minutes, and it had the ball in the lead. Had the ball with the lead in the late 3rd and 4th quarter 3 times, and it went into Iowa State territory 8 times in 10 possessions. And they lost that game. So I understand both perspectives of Tom Herman brought this program to a point where it wasn't in the tail end of the Mack Brown era and in the Charlie Strong era. But on the other hand, Tom Herman has lost a lot of winnable games at Texas. So you have both sides. You're going to have to weigh out which one. My personal opinion is I think Tom Herman should stay, and I'd like to see how Tom Herman does in the post-Sam Ehlinger era. How does he do when his quarterback isn't the same player he's worked with the last 4 years? The entire Herman era has been the entire Ehlinger era, and the two haven't been separated yet. But how does Texas do next year with Hudson Card at quarterback, who I assume takes the starting role? Herman's a very good recruiter. He's brought in a lot of 5-star prospects. He almost brought in the quarterback who just transferred to Ohio State and was the top quarterback prospect, I think, of 2022 or 2023. So he's got some guys, but that's another reason that people actually want Herman to leave, is he lost that recruit right there. But he gets a lot of talented guys like Bijan Robinson, guys like Caden Stearns in the secondary, and BJ Foster were all highly touted recruits. And I think Texas fans want those recruiting rankings, which are a little more arbitrary than actual game results, but those recruiting determined game results. But for now, I keep him, see what happens another year, give him one more, and see if Texas can mold it into a Big 12 championship, or at least be in the conversation in that race.
Well, Texas seems to be the big aberration in the last 10 years of not being able to transfer the recruiting rankings into actual wins. If you look at the recruiting rankings top to bottom, especially the top 5 to 10 in the nation, they pretty much reflect the best programs in the nation, i.e. Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State, Georgia in particular. And there just hasn't been that correlation. Tom Herman's won 60% of his games. Is that good enough? Well, in my estimation, Texas is the type program right there with the ones that I just mentioned that should be competing for the conference championship every year. Now, there's going to be a down year from time to time in which they're going to fall out and go 7-5, 8-4, something in that range. But they should be competing for a conference championship with Oklahoma. So over a 10-year span, those two programs are basically going to split the conference championship, and maybe somebody else sneaks in 1 or 2 times in the span of a decade. But Texas, as a conference championship contender, by extension, is competing for the college football playoff most of the time. And obviously, that has not been the program for quite some time, since 2010, basically. And that's what I expect it to be. Now, Tom Herman, looking at what he accomplished at stops like Ohio State and then as a head coach at Houston, and just to hear the man at the podium talk about football, he seems like a capable leader. And there are other indications, recruiting being number one, that he is going to get it done at Texas and be successful. It just hasn't really happened to date. All right. Anything else, Steve?
I thought that Sugar Bowl win was a huge mark of success, a top 10 finish for Texas. I don't think anybody expected that coming out of the year in 2018, especially with a loss to Maryland. So I know it gets made fun of all the time on Twitter every time Texas loses. I thought Sam Ehlinger absolutely deserved that "we're back" that he launched after that Georgia game, because Texas did that. Nobody had them beating Georgia. They were 2 touchdown underdogs in that game. They won a New Year's Six Bowl. They made a Big 12 championship, and they finished in the top 10. That was a "we're back" season for Texas. They need just another one of those. I mean,
but that's the problem, Steve. They're not back when they don't back it up. You're not back if you do it in a splash moment and then you regress.
Yes. And then another thing was just, you said that they should be competing for Big 12 titles every year, which I can see why some people say that just based on recruiting rankings alone. But when the Big 12's existed since 1995, and they've won 3 titles. This isn't just a couple years thing or a couple coaches thing. If you win 3 titles in, what is that, 25 years, then it seems to be more of a trend than an aberration, I would say.
Then they need to get the right guy that can win Big 12 championships.
Yes, that could be true. And I think there's a lot of programs in the Big 12 that also want to win those championships. So it's not just Texas right now. Oklahoma's pretty much hogging that conference title every year, and I think it's just a race to try to knock off Oklahoma for a lot of teams. I mean, we saw TCU looked pretty good in the mid-2010s. We've seen some Baylors here and there. Oklahoma State in the early 2010s had some nice runs, especially in 2011 when they almost went to the national championship. But yeah, I think Texas wants to be one of those teams that maybe has one of those special seasons. Like we mentioned, 2011 Oklahoma State, 2014 TCU, where you can upend Oklahoma and be in the national championship conversation. And they're a Big 12 team that has not done that in the last 10 years.
But I think that's part of the point, is that Texas is not one of those other schools. They're not TCU or Iowa State. They're Texas. So they're the state school with the national brand and the history that completely overshadows all those other schools in the Big 12. And they've got the recruiting footprint in the arguably the most talented state in the country. And therefore, the championships are expected, and a special season for an Oklahoma State or a TCU shouldn't be a special season at Texas. Ohio State, Alabama, Clemson, they're not saying any of their seasons are special seasons. They're just another season. Michigan, in a similar fashion, is demanding and wanting championships out of Jim Harbaugh, even though they really haven't won championships, none in the Big Ten since 2004. So it's a good conversation, and certainly I don't expect Tom Herman to be along much longer if he continues to only win 60% of his games.